Good afternoon, everyone. We're just waiting a couple minutes to make sure people are getting in and joining. Welcome to this webinar. I'm Andrea Carlise. I am the Executive Director of the International Action Network for Gender, Equity, and Law, or IANGEL. And we're glad to have you all here. I'm just going to give maybe one more minute for additional people to join, and then I'll go ahead and start. So thank you all so much for attending. As I said, I'm Andrea Carlise, the Executive Director of the International Action Network for Gender, Equity, and Law, or IANGEL. Let me just tell you a bit about IANGEL. We're a small nonprofit organization, a 501c3, based in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm broadcasting from our office in Alameda, California. And the mission of IANGEL is to harness the power of pro bono lawyers and connect them to the cause of gender equality locally, nationally, and globally. Currently, we have a few projects that are focusing on our primary areas of reproductive justice, peace and security, and women and girls empowerment. And one of those focus areas is anti-human trafficking. We do this through education, advocacy, and direct pro bono engagement. And today we are proud to be partnering with the Alameda County District Attorney's Office, Justice at Last, and Missy to provide this educational webinar on supporting minor survivors of human trafficking. We are partners with these organizations in a grant that the Alameda County District Attorney's Office received from the Department of Justice, and we are proud to be working with our partners on this project to combat human trafficking and to provide wraparound services with a number of partner organizations for minor survivors of trafficking in the San Francisco Bay Area. So today we will be hopefully hearing from Nancy O'Malley at some point. Unfortunately, we're having some tech issues and she hasn't been able to join the webinar. So given that, we're gonna go ahead and start by presenting a short film. This film is called Child for Sale. It's an award-winning film from a Harvard Film Festival by Fiona Bock, who happens to be the daughter of Sharmin Bock, Assistant District Attorney, who is going to be presenting today. Fiona filmed this award-winning film called Child for Sale. It presents the issue of child sex trafficking without shame or exploitation, framing the issue with respect for the people who have lived through it, and ultimately showing that these children are young adults and they're not different from other American youth. They're human beings with stories to tell. So I'd like to have Joelle queue up and play this short film for us.
I have sticks in my hair. Like, people would never have guessed, like, me walking into a store that I was stuck doing what I was doing.
You are not taller than me.
And there's no body type, there's no skin color, there's no age, there's no location where it's everywhere.
And we all fall down.
For over 5 years, I have worked to draw attention to an injustice few seem to know or care about: sex trafficking in the United States. I learned about this from my mom, a district attorney who founded the first human exploitation and trafficking unit in the country. When I was younger, she told me about cases where girls were kidnapped or tricked into thinking they were loved and then sold.
Even though it may look like some girls are willing and stuff, you just never know the backstory, you know, of why it may seem like that or why they, like, it's just crazy to think that people think that girls chose that life. You just don't wake up one day and say, oh, I want to be walking the track and have sex with men for money. Like, nobody ever wakes up thinking that.
Right now, I'm on my way to a safe house in Northern California, where I will interview a group of survivors ranging in age from 14 to 19.
I'm 17, I'm from Chicago.
I'm 16, I'm from Ohio.
My age is 19.
I'm from California, and I'm 14 years old.
Did your life growing up affect your involvement in human trafficking?
I ran away from home, and my pimp came up to me and told me like, oh, you're beautiful. You know, at that time I didn't know what he is.
Like, a lot of pimps do that. They find a girl that's a runaway or broken or lost, you know, they find the vulnerable ones. That's what they do. They know how to choose them.
Is there anything that was going on like with your family that allowed this to happen?
When I was 12, I was raped, and I felt like nobody in my family, they all kind of, you know, pushed it away. I just didn't feel like I had a home anymore.
My parents, they never really had money, so my dad kind of took advantage of me being the only girl in the family and used me so we could provide for their needs, as they'd say. So.
How old were you?
It was before I could remember. I started having flashbacks and stuff at the age of like 6 and all that, so.
Do you remember any like emotions, like particular events, images, anything like that?
Yeah. Yeah, I remember a lot.
Like, I remember every single time my phone rang, I would just start crying because it just got so hard. And then just after every guy left, you know, you just look at them and you just want to be like, why would you do that? You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was hard. Like, it's just, you know, constantly crying. Like, every time you were done getting in the shower, just, you know, falling to the ground and just crying and like begging God, like, why am I in this situation?
I've always felt like broken and nasty and dirty around people, and the thing I struggled with was like going through counseling and all that. I didn't want to do it. I just wanted to be normal, and I've told that to a lot of people. I just want to be normal, and I don't even really know what normal is. I just know it's not what I've been through. It's literally taken like pieces out of me that I know I can't get back, so. My story doesn't define who I am. I'm better than that. It's not my fault all this stuff had happened to me.
Hope you all enjoyed that impressive film by Fiona Bock. I'm proud to welcome Sharmin Bock here. And I believe that Nancy O'Malley will actually be coming into Sharmin's office in a moment. And it is my pleasure to introduce you to Nancy O'Malley. For those of you who don't know her, and I'm sure many of you do, Nancy O'Malley is the district attorney for the county of Alameda. She founded the Human Exploitation and Trafficking Unit in 2006 and has led the statewide charge in response to human trafficking. This has involved vigorously prosecuting traffickers, particularly those selling children for sex, targeting the purchasers, and changing perceptions about those trafficked, treating them as not as criminals, but as victims and survivors. Nancy carries out this proud legacy as the first woman to serve as Alameda County's elected district attorney, and as a leader known throughout California for her innovation and vision. Nancy is also an esteemed past president of California Lawyers, and I'm happy to introduce her. Welcome, Nancy. Sorry about the issues getting you on.
That's all right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very, very kind introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm really, really happy to be here with you today. I will say that this office was the first district attorney's office in the country to actually create a unit that was focused on the rights and support of victims of crime. And that has not changed. In fact, over the several years since the DA at the time created the Victim Witness Division, we have just continued to expand it. So now in my office, we have over 45 staff that are dedicated to working with victims. And quite uniquely, we have a staff of victim advocates who work directly with trafficked individuals. And I think that's critical. It's critical for us to understand the dynamic, the trauma, the circumstances under which people become trafficked individuals, so that as we support them going through, hopefully, their separation, their recovery, and then being able to build a life for themselves, that we are being appropriate and making sure that we are educated and sensitized to how to engage with people who have had that kind of an experience. This is really important, this conference that you're attending right now, because the law has recently changed, not a lot, but changed enough so that it's important to know how we will be able to move forward with vacatures or even asserting affirmative defense if somebody ends up being charged with a crime. I'm going to talk about that very briefly in a few minutes, because I know your very experienced presenters will be talking about it in more detail over the next day and a half. I also want to say that that in Alameda County, that we created some time ago a countywide advisory committee. The advisory committee is called Alameda County United Against Human Trafficking. For short, we call it AC United. And under that, we also have a specific labor trafficking task force. And part of the benefit and part of the importance of having these advisory committees or these task forces is to really bring people together so that we aren't inadvertently creating cracks that people fall through. So while we're talking about vacatures and perhaps affirmative defense, that somebody was engaged in criminal conduct as a result of being a trafficked person, that we have, in so many ways, we have the opportunity to prevent people from falling into that area of the law. Sharmin Bock, who you hear from a little bit later, and I have been very, very involved in developing the policies for the state of California. In fact, I recall that back in 2003, we wrote a bill to outline human trafficking, and we got nowhere in the legislature. They thought we were crazy. What are we talking about? And then the next year, there was a working group that we both participated in, eventually passed a law. But the law was really said, whatever the federal law is, that's what California will follow. That was not good enough for us here in California, always being a leader. And so as we continued to write and kind of work around the fact that we didn't have a very clear and honest definition of human trafficking, that we continued to get legislation passed. But then in 2012, with Proposition 35, we really changed the whole character of human trafficking and the recognition of human trafficking and defining it with real terms and representing real circumstances. Why does this matter in terms of vacatur and other legal opportunities? Because it's very easy for people that are uneducated to ignore the root circumstance. it's very easy for communities to just ignore human trafficking by just looking the other way or not understanding. And so being able to clearly define and understand the dynamic of human trafficking moves our ability to erase some of those old convictions or some of the convictions, or to prevent a conviction from happening if it's a result of human trafficking. Back in 2000, and we started in 2004, as I said, but all the way through 2009, developed a community blueprint for how communities could come together to combat human trafficking in their various areas. We call it HEAT Watch. HEAT is human exploitation and trafficking. And I know many of you know about HEAT Watch. HEAT really started with, okay, we need to train the police officers to understand that what they're seeing are trafficked individuals and not prostitutes or teen prostitutes, which we never use that term. I hope nobody does. But we've spent a lot of time training police officers. So far, we've trained probably 15 to 20,000 police officers through our initiative. The second prong is to prosecute cases. And I'm very proud to tell you that we have prosecuted over 800 human trafficking cases. Right now, and Sharmin will give you the exact number when she speaks, but right now we have over 70 cases waiting for trial. And those are specific in sex trafficking. We have a whole other unit that's dealing with labor trafficking. So that second prong of prosecution is critically important. The third prong was to develop relationships and develop organizations, support organizations that are grounded in the community. Community-based groups, you'll hear from Missy, one of the very first in the country. You'll hear from other community-based organizations. The reality is that many people who have been in that situation, who have been trafficked, do not want to call the police, at least at first. We really need to create a place for people to receive support that wasn't law enforcement, it wasn't the court system. And so our community-based organizations are critical partners to us. The fourth prong, as I said earlier, that we had no laws, we had no resources, we had no awareness by our elected officials, both in Sacramento and in Washington, D.C. So we spent a lot of time educating decision makers and policymakers. And you know, just like I do, that once we educate the policymakers and we start changing the laws, the resources will follow. And this is an area where resources have never been more critical. And then the fifth prong is engaging our community, making sure that people in our community understand the dynamic of human trafficking. They understand what people go through. They recognize it and they don't discount it or discard it or ignore it. Really, it's one of the most critical parts of our effort is to make sure our communities know what human trafficking is and support the efforts to protect people and to help people become whole after that traffic experience. January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. Well, let's say President Obama declared January 11 Human Trafficking Awareness Day, but we've decided we're making it the whole month. So I know many of you participated in our efforts. We have a big billboard campaign. We put signage on bus shelters. We flood the community with information about human trafficking. And we don't just do it in January, although that puts a big spotlight on the issues of human trafficking. And I know many of you who are on this webinar are going to be participating in various ways across our region to make sure that we are honoring the month of January and taking the opportunity to educate our community. I want to tell you just my own opinion why vacatures are so critically important. We know, those of us have worked in this field, just what the impact of human trafficking is. We have met and talked to thousands and thousands of people who have been trafficked. And as they describe their plight, they describe their relationship, and I put that in quotes, with the trafficker, that they're in all decision-making about themselves, what they do, what happens with their body, their safety, their health, all those are taken away from them by the trafficker in order to keep that trafficker in charge of their life. We never, ever miss the opportunity to remind everyone that trafficking is slavery. Plain and simple, it's slavery. And so we also know that traffickers manipulate the victims and now survivors. They manipulate them in ways that people engage in conduct they wouldn't otherwise do on their own. And that's really where vacatur becomes so critical. I'm going to share a story with you about a case that happened here recently. It was a young woman who was over at the Home Depot in Oakland, and she was engaged with some man who owned a truck, and he was getting something out of the bed of the truck, and she started driving the truck. He was in the back, and he was kind of being flung around because she was driving about 80 miles an hour through the streets of Oakland into San Leandro. There happened to be a police officer at Home Depot who saw this happen, and he followed her, lights and siren, and she just kept going. So by the time that the truck came to a stop, the man wasn't injured, but shaken up. The police arrested her. And when the case was brought to us, it was brought to us as a carjacking, which she was charged with, a very serious crime. Well, when I heard about the case, and when Sharmin heard about the case, we talked about it. And our radar went up that something was not right. There was more to this story than the fact that she had just stolen this truck or carjacked this truck. So we dug deeper, and what we discovered was that she had been trafficked from the state of Washington, that she had a family up there that loved and supported her. The trafficker had taken her into Las Vegas. She had been trafficked on the streets of Las Vegas, eventually came to California, worked their way up to Oakland, and that she was put on the street right outside that Home Depot with the trafficker across, making sure that she was doing what he directed her to do. So when this man came up and solicited her and tried to engage with her in commercial sex, that triggered her, and she took off trying to get away. So the end result of that was, we know that she engaged in what some would define as carjacking, a crime, but she did it for her own safety to try to get away from this horrific, horrible situation she was in. What we ended up doing was we dismissed the human trafficking case, the carjacking case. We bought a plane ticket. We talked with her family and her supporters up in Washington State. We knew she was going to need more than family support, so we talked to abolitionist groups up there. We were able to put her on a plane from Oakland up to Seattle, where she was met by her family and other supporters. And the last information we heard, she was doing very, very well, having been finally separated from a trafficker. Now, in that case, we were able to prevent her from being convicted of human trafficking, but that's because we became aware of this. And so I urge all of you, when you are working with someone who's been convicted of a crime, who has committed the crime as a result of being trafficked, please dig until you get the full story. It doesn't mean every crime that's committed by someone who's been trafficked is as a result of trafficking, but for those that are, we have an enormous tool, both in our vacatur proceedings and also in asserting affirmative defense. Later in your seminar, you're going to hear more and in more detail about AB Senate Bill 124, which was sponsored by now Senator Kamlager. And there are some changes that are made in the vacatur law that make it a broader understanding of how the vacatur law can be utilized effectively for trafficked individuals. So I know that it will be very, very informative, and I'm just very grateful to Andrea, Carlise, and to IANGEL, and to all of you for being here to learn more about this very insidious crime and what we as professionals can do, coming together, working together, closing those gaps, and being able to help people have their life back. Thank you, Andrea, very much.
Thank you so much, Nancy. We really appreciate you presenting at the webinar and all the work that you're doing with Heat Watch. And I think that story you told is really important for people to understand the value of knowing what human trafficking is, how to identify it, and how to use the laws to benefit survivors. So thank you so much, Nancy. And again, sorry about the connection issues.
All right, I'm turning the camera over to Sharmin.
Okay, great. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Sharmin Bock, who is an assistant district attorney with the County of Alameda. Sharmin is a 33-year veteran prosecutor, a nationally recognized expert in human trafficking. She has a long and successful track record of recovering commercially sexually exploited children and holding traffickers accountable. These Bios of our presenters are also in the agenda packet that you should have received via email. So without further ado, Sharmin is going to give us the initial training essentially on Human Trafficking 101.
Hello, well, it's my pleasure to be here, and what a wonderful talk by Nancy O'Malley, who has really been such a leader in the field of human trafficking. And I distinctly remember the role that she played in bringing to bear the Vacatur laws, and we are so fortunate to have her leadership in this area and from the very beginning, and a hard act to follow, let me say. So welcome, and thank you all for your commitment to making a difference in this area. As Nancy mentioned, let's see, I'm having difficulty moving from one slide to the next. I'm not using my cursor, it's not shifting. Stop using that. Use this for arrows. As Nancy mentioned, trafficking is slavery, and it's slavery no matter what form it takes. And it belongs on the same spectrum of violence, sexual assault, domestic violence, and other interpersonal forms of violence. And as we know, it spans the range from labor trafficking, street prostitution, hotels and motels. But today's talk, the focus is going to be on child sex trafficking. What is child sex trafficking? Really, it's when a minor exchanges sexual activity for money or some other commodity, such as survival sex for home, food, and she or he is treated like a commercial and a sexual object. Back in the day, the child used to be caught in a no man's land between victim and offender, but no longer, actually, much thanks to Nancy, who made sure that children could no longer be arrested and prosecuted, and are now treated completely as they should be, as victims. We're focusing on commercial sexual exploitation of children, also known as CSEC, because the Bay Area is a hotspot also for child sex trafficking. It is not just the Bay Area, but nationally. And these are numbers, again, that are really hard to quantify, but 100 to 300,000, it's estimated, are trafficked every year in the US. So really, what's hard to get our mind around, it's the fastest growing criminal enterprise in the country, yielding billions of dollars annually. And sadly, there's no better return for your money these days. And I know we've been reading about Tesla stock and so forth, but when you come right down to it, there's very low overhead, there's very low risk, because many of these children are trauma bonded to their traffickers, and the yield is just very high. There's something else that actually adds to the low risk, and that is, I think, a role that we all play, and that is in the perpetuation of myths and misconceptions that allow this to carry on. Nancy referred to teen prostitution, and that falls in the category of language. Now, why is language so important in the way in which we describe child sexual exploitation? I mean, look at the difference between terms like prostitute and victim, pimp and trafficker, John and purchaser. Language really dictates how we perceive the problem and how we respond to it. It also perpetuates the myths and misconceptions. And, there are a whole ton of myths and misconceptions from, prostituted youth make lots of money. They drive fancy cars. They live in big houses. They wear nice clothes. They look like models. They do it because they want to. The magnitude of the myths are outrageous, really. And when you just put the language side by side, what difference does the label make? Really, a label makes a whole bunch of difference, because if you hear teen prostitute, teen prostitution, what do you think? What do they think if they hear commercial sexual exploitation of children What do you think? What do they think? Who are they? What do they look like? Whose problem is it? I mean, really important to think about that. Do you think that teen prostitutes and CSEC are the same? Well, under the law, they are the same. And if there is in the back of your head a difference, a distinction, that's a bias, that's a misconception, and that's actually baggage that needs to be examined. So we actually need to start talking about what CSEC, and that's the term of art you could be using now going forward, commercial sexual exploitation of children or commercially sexually exploited children, what that actually looks like. And having a conversation about the appropriate use of language, because children are not prostitutes, they are victims. Pimps are not pimps because of the multi-billion-dollar business this is in. They are traffickers. Okay, there is no such thing as a child prostitute. That's something that's so important to remember. And the only people that profit from these labels are traffickers, and buyers get to hide behind the undeserved anonymity of being called a John, sort of like a Jane Doe versus a child abuser. Now, something that I think is really important, it's something that has come to me in my own thought processes. This isn't something that I've heard from somebody else, but you know, I think our society has placed this premium, this sort of arcane premium on being chaste. And when you think about it, it's a double standard when it comes to sex, because you can be as sexually active as you want as a man, but when it comes to a woman, if you're sexually active, you're called what? You're called a prostitute, you're called a whore, you're called a slut. But you can be in the White House and be sexually active and be president, and there's no judgment. And that is gender bias in its purest form. And when these stereotypes and judgments influence juror assessments of credibility, when the jurors look at that child on the witness stand and think, she's been just too sexually active to be believable, that's when we've got to draw the line and really start to examine the baggage and the myths and the misconceptions that are perpetuating stereotypes that then impact the quality of justice that is received in our society. Stereotypes about promiscuity also shift blame from those who should be held accountable, the traffickers, the purchasers, to the victims. And who are they? They are the most vulnerable amongst us. And what have they experienced? They've experienced everything from generational trauma to historic oppression, discrimination, and other forms of injustice and inequity. Another myth that I think perpetuates this problem is that it's just not happening in our backyard. You know, and it's very common in the field that we hear people say, oh, you know, it just happens. It happens, you know, in Asia. It happens, people are brought in shipping containers. It happens over international borders. Well, that's actually not true. It can happen to anyone, and it's happening in your backyard. If there's a hotel in your neighborhood, it's happening. And these are very common realities in the anti-human trafficking field. We see it. We see it happening. We see it happening, and yet the commercial sexual exploitation of children, and this is one of the few slides that I'm going to read verbatim, is the most hidden form of child abuse in North America today. It's the nation's least recognized epidemic. Who are these children? Well, we see in Alameda County the average age between 13 and 17, but the average age of entry is between 12 and 14. They're urban, suburban, rural youth with a long history of trauma. And the very problematic is that they also don't see themselves as victims. And they've been indoctrinated to mistrust the system. And in many cases, rightfully so, because the system has failed them. They have fallen through every crack in the system. And what happens then is that you have the traffickers and the bottom feeders, and they're coming down to scoop the children up. And with the baggage, with the myths and misconceptions that we have, we turn away. We don't look. You know, the soccer mom driving her child from past the child on the corner in a miniskirt and boots thinks, why doesn't she just get a job at McDonald's? Not recognizing that it's not a choice. And that child was drawn to pimping, was drawn to all of this by popular culture and social media. But, you know, they think that it's going to be just some big, great party. They're promised heaven and they're delivered unto hell. It's not, but the reality of slavery gets lost in all the blame. And it's not what they expect it to be. And they might start out willingly, but then they want to leave. And they're looking for love in all the wrong places. They're looking for a sense of family and a sense of belonging, and then they can't get out. And what I found in all my years of doing this is really that the common denominator is low self-esteem and looking for love in all the wrong places. Social media plays a very big role in this. So you've got the push factors that's pushing them towards it, right? No system support, self-esteem. You know, many of these kids aren't going to school. And, you know, let me just talk about school for a second. In school, you're taught, if you go to school, you're taught English, math, and science, but you're not taught what love looks like. So then you think that, yeah, maybe, you know, if this guy says, I love you, baby, and I can't make the rent, but would you just go have sex with these 15 guys so we can make the rent and I'll be with you forever, that maybe is what love is, and that you should just put up with that to get your McDonald's number 4 Happy Meal at the end of the day. I mean, I've had cases where that is exactly what happened. And there's a part of them that have the pull factors. They've seen the Pretty Woman movie. They've seen the you know, Academy Award that won Pimpin' song won the Academy Award for Best Music Video or whatever. They've seen all of that. They've got the Cinderella fantasy happening. And so it creates quite a tension. Now in Alameda County, we have served through a program called Safety Net since 2011. And this is data up since December of 2020. We have served 6,025 youth. And who are these youth? We have 72% prior victimization, 63% are runaways. And I don't need to read this chart for you, and we're short on time, so I'm going to keep trying to go quickly, but 98% have been girls. We have not seen as many boys, but we're seeing more boys and more transgender youth as time progresses. There's a great degree of system involvement, meaning that they've previously been in the custody of social services. And we know that social services has a lot of cracks in their system. And unfortunately, the way the law has been written is that now social services has been given even more of that responsibility. So the cracks are even widening further. And we see the breakdown of ethnicity. And, you know, technically it's true. Anyone can be trafficked in any community, just as anyone can be the victim of any kind of crime. But as the data shows that you've seen, the real story is that while it can happen to anyone, the majority of our victims here in Alameda County are Black and brown and have experienced trauma, discrimination, and other inequities that create community-wide vulnerabilities that must be addressed. Who is the modern day pimp? Well, let's just talk about who we see in the news, R. Kelly and Jeffrey Epstein. And they come across, we have the boyfriend pimp, which is the Romeo pimp, the business partner pimp that says, hey, let's do this together. And then they don't see the dime, and the gorilla pimp who just grabs you off the street and takes you in. And what do the purchasers look like? Unfortunately, they're the ones you least expect, and literally anyone from any walk of life, from immigrant workers to high-tech Silicon Valley execs. Are the purchasers. And who are the recruiters? How do the minors get into the life? Well, we think our children are safe in their bedrooms while we are, let's say, in the living room, but we know that their iPhones are glued to their hand, and that's the direct line to the trafficker, social media, the telephone. And then they go to the mall. I had a case where a child went into the mall and thought that she was meeting with some nice boy that she met online, but he was actually a much older male who was a recruiter for a trafficker. And we had to actually end up buying her back to get her back to her family. What are the recruitment methods that we see? Sadly, parents sell children. You've heard that in the video. One of the girls there was sold when she was 6 years old by her family for money, so they could, as she said, make ends meet. We are seeing today much more force and violence because of the large financial gain that exists. There's a lot of peer recruitment, and there's a lot of Romeo pimping still happening. We can go through red flags later, but obviously older boyfriends, sudden access to cash, not going to school, tattoos. And what's pimp culture? Pimp culture, manipulation, illusion of a family system. Again, I told you social services does not make for a good family structure. They feel like a wife, but then what happens? Violence becomes normalized, substance abuse, heavy addiction becomes everyday issue. And experimentation is then common. It's a very sad state of affairs. If we had more time, I would get more into the language of it with you. But this is some of the language that is important when you're doing your vacatures, right? That when you say it's a direct, we'll hear about direct result of pimping, is your client a renegade? A renegade is when they work on their own. They're not working for anybody. Out of pocket is when they are working for somebody else, when they're switching from one trafficker to the next. Choosing up is when you decide to go work for a trafficker. There'll be, I'm sure when you get to this work, we can get you a cheat sheet with work. Now, what are we seeing as trends? We're seeing a lot more violence. I'm sure you've heard in the news, the homicides that are happening on International Boulevard, which is where that film took place that Fiona did. On my team, we have about 75 human trafficking related cases right now. I think we're at 76 right now. We just got a new one. And we have homicides for the first time in a long time on our caseload, and quite a few. A lot of the times we're having the traffickers are giving guns to the girls, and we're actually seeing more female traffickers than before, and much more violence also from the females. A lot of tattooing, and a lot of branding, much like cattle are branded. And we're seeing gang involvement, where the gangs are thinking, you can only sell drugs once, but you can sell children over and over again. And so why not sell children? In recognizing the complexities of these cases, in 2005, the HEAT unit was formed. I'm currently the head of the HEAT unit, and I was actually the first head of the HEAT unit when it was formed in 2005. It was the first of its kind in the United States. The majority of our victims are US citizens. We've had victims as young as 11. These are our stats up to December of 2020. This number is much higher now, since we're now in almost the end of 2021. I think we're closer to, I don't know, maybe we're much higher than 800 at this point. It's myself and 3 other lawyers. We're working pretty much nonstop. So that is sort of the background. And I thought it was really important to give you that context in order for you to understand better the statutory framework, the law, which I think you need to understand well so that you can do the vacatur work that's so important. So what's the law that existed before the trafficking law? And I call them the dinosaurs. So pimping and pandering law. What is pimping? You have to prove that the defendant knew that the victim was a prostitute, and the money that the victim earned as a prostitute supported the defendant in whole or in part. And here's sort of the penalties, and it's a state prison case, but there's ways around it, and the penalties are fairly low. Pandering is when you encourage somebody to become a prostitute, or you influence them to become a prostitute. But engaging in prostitution isn't required. And you can even be guilty of pandering by asking an undercover officer to engage in pandering. So the person, it can include somebody who's already been a prostitute. Now, you might say, why do I need to know all of this? And you'll see in a minute, because it's tied into California's human trafficking law. So you heard Nancy talk about the first dads going to Sacramento, trying to get them to fix to better California's human trafficking law, which tried to mirror the federal law. So in 2005, California enacted the California Trafficking Victims Protection Act with reference to the federal law. Now, what did our California law say? It said the legislator finds the definition of human trafficking is equivalent to the federal definition. Okay, well, if that's actually what it meant, we would have been okay, but it's not what happened, because what our California law went on to do was not what the federal law says. This is what the federal law said. Federal law said sex trafficking is commercial sex, which is, and I'm looking at A here, induced by force, fraud, or coercion. And then here's the distinction: or in which the person induced to perform such act has not attained 18 years of age. So you see a distinction. If you're under 18, there's no force, fraud, or coercion requirement. But if you're over 18, there is. Okay. Now they also talk about labor, but I'm not going to focus on that. Now, what did our old California law say? Our old California law referred to the federal law, but didn't quite get it right. It said, you've got to prove that you intended to deprive or violate the personal liberty of another with the intent to effect or maintain a violation of, there you go, pimping and pandering, 266H and I. And 311, that's child porn. Okay, so that old California law didn't reflect the reality of trafficking. Now, what does the deprivation of liberty mean? Now, that's something that's important to recognize, because when you're doing this Vacatur stuff, this deprivation of liberty becomes relevant when you're talking about adults, but not under the new law, but not when you're talking about children. And it's kind of what you think it would mean. You look at it from a big picture point of view, and deprivation of liberty is what you think it would be: fraud, deceit, coercion, all of that stuff, even threatening somebody else. Now, so for crimes committed prior to November 7th of 2012, which was the effective date of Prop 35, there was a requirement that the minor be forced or under duress or coerced. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, coercion eludes the coerced. How many of you here have been tricked? I mean, I certainly have. Or let's just talk about relationships. How many of you tricked in a relationship? I have, and I had no idea that like the person didn't really care or wanted something or whatever. And how are we as adults or as legislators going to require children to come into a courtroom and articulate that they've been coerced when we as adults aren't even able to do that in our own relationships? So our law actually failed, our old law, to reflect the reality of human trafficking as it occurs on the streets and online. So what did we do? There was a watershed change in the human trafficking law. I was very proud to be able to be a part of that change. As one of the co-authors of Prop 35 Case Act, we made some pretty important changes. And Chris Kelly, who used to be the former chief privacy officer of Facebook, said, you know what, we're going to take this to the ballot. So it got the required signatures thanks to his generosity and funding, and it got on the ballot, and it passed higher than any initiative on any ballot in the history of California, with bipartisan support from everybody. And we divided labor and sex trafficking, and we also divided adult and child sex trafficking, and increased monetary penalties required sex registration for sex traffickers and dramatically increased the penalties so that it wasn't just cost of doing business, the penalty, because before it was sort of like a slap on the hand. So what labor trafficking, we're not going to get into it today, but there does need to be a showing that the personal liberty of somebody was violated. Now for adults, which we're not focusing on today, it again, you do need to show that an adult was forced, coerced, or under duress when engaged in, when made to engage in human trafficking, that their personal liberty was restricted. The sex trafficking of minors is divided into two sections, 236C1 and 236C2. 236C1 is when there's no showing of force. So she could be blowing him kisses and say, I love you. But if the defendant, if the trafficker caused, induced, persuaded, or attempted to cause, induce, or persuade a minor to engage in a commercial sex act, he's out of luck. He's looking at 5, 8, or 12 years in prison. Now, if he does that with force, fear, or I put force, fear, and fear, meant coercion, it's 15 to life. Now, you don't have to actually prove that he pimped or pandered her. You only need to prove that he intended to pimp or pander her. And why is the law that way? That he intended to pimp or pander is because it excludes the buyers. And there was the recognition that if that element was excluded from the law, that there'd be difficulty having it pass. And that's a conversation for another day. Really good things about this law. Mistake of fact as to age is not a defense, because so many times we would hear, oh, you know what, I had no idea she was 14. I thought she was 23. In fact, she told me she was 27 or 22, even though she's wearing Barney underwear. But so it was really ideal to have the law get on a ballot by way of an initiative, because we were able to write in everything we wanted in a law, like consent of the minor isn't a defense, because if you're under 18, you can't consent to sex. That's why this whole myth or misconception about choice is a bunch of hooey. And just like in rape, you can't say that somebody consented to be raped because they had previously had consensual sex. You can't say that somebody consented to be trafficked because they had previously engaged in commercial sex. That's off limits. The fines went up. If you cause great bodily injury, you can get up to 10 years. Additionally, if you have a prior, you get up to 5 years. Additionally. Okay, so what do we do to get the results that we need? We look for corroboration. We don't know, remember, we don't always have a victim, because the victim doesn't realize she is a victim. She thinks that she's in a relationship oftentimes when we get our cases. So we are looking at cell phones, we're looking at computers, we're looking at a variety of things that are on this list that I'm not going to read out because you guys can all read. What makes it so important that when you have somebody who doesn't even think they should be there talking to you about this case, there shouldn't even be a case, is that there be a coordinated response, right? Because they've drunk that Kool-Aid beverage, right? Where they're under the influence of their trafficker. And so you need a village to rescue, to recover that. I don't like the word rescue, excuse me, to recover that child and to hold the trafficker accountable. And let me just say that our office has a very strict policy that our primary focus is to recover the child, stabilize the child, and do whatever we can to empower and heal that child, irregardless of whether they choose to participate in the process. It's more the exception than the rule that they participate in the process, to be quite frank. And so we bring all of these partners together to have a coordinated response. Nancy talked to you about Heat Watch. That was actually a name she came up with, Heat Watch, because she based it on Neighborhood Watch, where you have communities come together to keep their communities safe. and she talked to you about the 5-point strategy. It's actually an award-winning strategy that other jurisdictions have implemented. And this is part of this Heat Watch program, is part of the training and outreach that we're doing right now to you, for example, to engage you into making a difference. And it's a blueprint that we have in a toolkit that we send out all over the country. What can you do? Well, you're doing it. You're doing pro bono work, and we're very grateful to you for that. There's a lot more you can do to get informed. I've compressed probably a 2-hour talk into, I don't know, I'm talking very quickly. If we ever have a chance to talk one-on-one, you'll see that I don't usually talk this fast. But check out heatwatch.org. It's our website. And I'm going to ask that you do one other thing. When you check it out, you'll see on the first page, it says, take the pledge. And please click on take the pledge and take the pledge to make a difference. Because when we'd like to have 1 million people take the pledge, it makes a difference when we go to Sacramento. It makes a difference when we go to Washington, D.C. We get the legislatures to actually pay some attention to us. We had spent 5 years, for example, trying to get the legislators to pay attention to us to take force, fraud, and coercion out of the requirement of the old law. And they didn't really pay attention to us until Prop 35 passed by a landslide margin. And they're like, hey, why didn't you check in with us on this? And we're like, yeah, we did, but you didn't do anything about it. And we lost 5 years in a row. So take the pledge, get others informed as you're getting informed. And if you see something, say something. And here's a really important number to have. One is the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And you can also text it. So if you do see something, you can text either the word be free or 23 37 33. And this is what the page will look like when you take the pledge. We also have a confidential tip line, and I'll get the tip. An inspector that I work with will get the tip, and we will act on that tip. It's anonymous. We work with the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. Sometimes I'll get calls at like 2 a.m. saying, could you help us? So we work not just locally with our partners, as we're working with our partners today, but we work nationally with our partners because human trafficking knows no borders. Our children are being shipped off to, Super Bowls, as you read about in the news, and whatever we can do to break down the silos like we are today, it is important to do, because when a child gets moved, let's say from just San Francisco to San Jose, they might as well sometimes be going to Taiwan, because even law enforcement don't necessarily communicate as they should with one another. So we're really doing our best to break down these silos so that we can better communicate with one another, share intelligence, really spread the word about what's going on. And if you need to get in touch with me, I'm happy to talk further with you. Here's my phone number, my email, here's the website, heatwatch.org, and our tip line. Now, let me see if I can stop sharing. And here I am. So thank you very much. And that leaves us an hour to go.
Thanks so much, Sharmin. I'm going to introduce really quickly Rose Mukhar so she can join us and provide the Vacatur part of our training today. Rose Mukhar is a social justice, human rights, and crime victims' rights attorney. She has experience in cases involving children, women, refugees, and survivors of domestic violence, torture, and human trafficking. She is the principal and founding attorney at Justice at Last, a nonprofit law firm that works to empower those who have been trafficked and commercially sexually exploited by providing access to free comprehensive legal services, advocacy, and specialized trainings to help transform survivors' lives. So welcome, Rose. I'm going to go ahead and let you take over and provide the next section of our training.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea. And Bravo, Sharmin. That was pretty impressive that you got all that in there in a short period of time. And it was really good information. So I hope that you were able to take notes and or view the recording, because it was a really good foundation for as we move forward. And I'm wondering also if Joelle is able to share my PowerPoint, that would be great. And we can get started. Thank you. And we can go on to the next page. And thanks for the introduction and this opportunity to be here. The Justice at Last is a nonprofit. We exclusively work with survivors of human trafficking, and regardless of age. So our youngest client we worked with was 11. Our oldest client was 77 at the time she was trafficked. We work with US citizens and foreign nationals. We work with male and female, or regardless of the gender identity or non-conforming gender. And we also work with survivors of labor trafficking and sex trafficking. And this is just a little caption about what we believe in and what we really come at the approach of the work that we do as a legal service provider is we understand it's critical to empower survivors. And the only way to really do that is to work with the community. Work with you all here today, wanting and are interested in doing pro bono work, working with service providers, working with law enforcement, working with faith-based organizations, just coming together. We build capacity by doing these trainings. We help create understanding. And by that, we're able to help stop the trafficking and then also support survivors. So I'm happy to move on to the next one. This is just a touch point about the different types of law and services that we provide as a legal service provider. We are in the Bay Area. We're serving 14 counties right now. We specialize in doing crime victim rights, which we're going to talk about tomorrow, and then also records clearance work, post-conviction relief. But there's a host of legal needs that survivors have. And so this is what you see here when we do our intakes. We're screening for all of this. Anything that's outside of this scope, we work with other service providers and help do referrals to get the survivors connected. And just so you know also, so we were founded in 2015. Year to date, we've served over 500 survivors. And right now, the percentages are about 72% are female, or those that identify as female. The rest would be those that identified as male. But we think it's really critical that you understand the majority of those that are trafficked are persons of color. And in particular, when we're talking about children that are being sex and or labor trafficked, they're primarily persons of color. 1 in 6 out of our clients are actually single parents. Over 50% identify as BIPOC. 34% of our clients speak a language other than English. So that's who we're working with, and we serve the Bay Area. So just as Sharmin and Nancy have articulated, it's happening here much more than I think we realize, and even that media covers. So we can go on to the next slide. So the training today is going to focus on post-conviction relief. Why is it critical? So just as Sharmin, fabulously explained about the process, about what happens to survivors, and that really endearing story that Nancy shared in the beginning about the individual who was trying to flee the trafficking situation and what the consequences of that, it's really critical that we take a step back and realize that those that are being arrested often are victims of human trafficking. And how do we help identify that? So there's a survey that was done by the National Survivor Network in 2015, and I surveyed over 100 survivors, whether sex or labor trafficked. And this was the results of that survey. Over 90% had been arrested while they were trafficked. 50% reported being arrested as minors, and over 25% reported being arrested at least 10 to 20 times. We see that in the work that we do. We have quite a few clients who have vacatur needs, records clearance needs, and they have 20 different arrests in different jurisdictions, and sometimes out of state of California. So we can go on to the next slide, and we'll look further about why it's also so important is because often what we see is the legal system just doesn't identify why the individual themselves might not identify as being a victim. But not only that, we see that the systems are overburdened. So it's harder, even when someone's working in the public defender's office. They might see some flags, but if the individual doesn't identify as a victim, they might be more apt to just have the client accept a plea and move forward. And so then the end result is that they have a criminal record while they're victims of human trafficking. We can go on to the next slide. So what are the barriers to survivors of trafficking when they've been criminalized? It's difficult to get a job, right? I mean, even today, what we know is that a potential employer can Google your name and see if there's any arrest, let alone they might actually do a background check. And so what does that mean when a survivor of trafficking has been criminalized and they're trying to stabilize and stay out of that situation, and they're trying to get a minimum wage earning job, and there's a background check and it comes back and it shows that they've got this criminal record. And so it makes that individual very vulnerable at that moment because they know what the background check is going to reveal. And so at that point, do they disclose to a potential employer that they were trafficked, that maybe they were sex trafficked, and that there's charges of prostitution or solicitation? And think about what that means to that individual who's trying to get a job, and they've got to share this with a complete stranger, potential new employer. And then what? That vulnerability. We've seen clients have shared with us stories about they debated, either they walk away, they don't apply for the job, or they share at that moment what happened to them. And we've had 2 clients come back and say that they were propositioned after they shared what had happened to them, that they had a criminal record before the background check had been done. They were propositioned that, oh, that's okay, don't worry about it, but meet me tomorrow night at 7 p.m. and you might be able to get the job. So just think about that. So that's one of the other barriers. And then you see the other ones here as well, the difficulties of pursuing an education, getting a school loan, getting a car loan, and just the impact on the stability of the family. We can move on. So again, let's go back to this question: is why is it so important that we have these post-conviction laws? And it really helps to remedy this injustice. And just again, think about it. If you're a victim of human trafficking, whether it's sex or labor trafficking, and you're forced to commit a crime as part of that trafficking, and the first interaction you have with the quote unquote justice system is that you're deemed a criminal. And the impact of that individual is not going to trust the justice system at all. So it's really critical about why we have these laws. And then what does it do? It helps empower that survivor. They finally get the opportunity to share what happened to them. And it's being shared with the judge, it's being shared with the prosecutor, and it's being shared with their attorney. And that, for many of our clients, is super empowering to just have that opportunity to be listened to. And they also get to control that whole process. They're deciding if they want to move forward and get their records cleared. In all honesty, the majority of our clients that want vacatur work on their records have been out of the life, that vulnerability, that lifestyle for a period of time. It's not necessarily as the individual victim survivor is no longer being trafficked that they realize their record has been impacted. They usually need stability. They need an opportunity to move forward. And so most of the clients that we're working with that we're doing vacatur work have been out of the trafficking situation for at least 3, if not 5 to 6 years. And again, it gives them that opportunity to make an impact directly on the justice system. We can go to the next slide, please. So and we can move on to the next one. We're just going to break down a little bit about what it looks like when an individual gets a record, and what we're looking at when we're doing post-conviction relief. So there's vacatur, and that's going to undo a conviction. And the best way to explain that is it's literally erasing that conviction off their criminal record. Expungement isn't that dramatic of a result. It removes the conviction from the criminal record, but it's not undone. And the guilt finding is not voided. So there's still this there's these obligations to before you can even seek expungement. And sealing, the conviction remains on the record, but it's sealed, so no one can get access to it without a court order. However, we do know with particular background checks, and in particular when it's the government doing background checks, that those convictions can be seen. So for sure, vacatur here in the state of California is an incredible law for survivors of human trafficking. And as Nancy talked about in the very beginning, the law is going to be opening up and expanding to some degree in 2022. And we can talk about that at a later time, but we can move on to this slide now. So vacatur statutes, this is looking at it from not globally, but from US national base. So New York is the first state that actually comes up with a vacatur law specifically for survivors of sex trafficking. But it's tied to prostitution convictions, prostitution, solicitation, and illicit massage. So it's very specific. But once New York established that, then you start to see other states doing something very similar. And so California has one of the more broader liberal vacatur laws because it's not tied to just individuals that have been sex trafficked. So it's not just prostitution charges. So anybody who's even labor trafficked that's forced to sell marijuana or they have a weapon on them at the time of their arrest, as long as it's not a violent felony, at least where the law is right now through the end of this year, as long as it's not violent, they are able to seek vacatur. And if we go to the next slide, I believe there's a map and it shows generally and it's kind of small, but you have the handouts and you can actually look it up on the Freedom Network USA, where it breaks it down, where states have some form of vacatur for survivors of trafficking. Usually it's primarily tied to individuals that have sex trafficked. Sometimes it's very narrow and it's only for youth. And then there's 3 states that we have right now in the United States, 3 or 4 actually, that don't have any form of relief for individuals that are trafficked, that are forced to commit crimes. We can go on to the next slide. So let's talk specifically about what's going on in California. And Sharmin again did this phenomenal education about the history of the laws. We actually have to go back to Penal Code 236.14 in 2017 when vacatur is created, the first opportunity then to give victims of trafficking a fresh start, which is what we're going to do right now. And if I'm running short on time, shout out, and Sharmin, please join at any time. We can go to the next slide. So here's the elements. If we look at the code, that we would have to meet as a pro bono attorney or an attorney who's representing a survivor of human trafficking for their records clearance. So we've got to show that they actually were a victim of human trafficking, that they have an eligible offense so that it's not a violent offense, that there's a nexus between the arrest and the conviction to the trafficking, and then looking at the timeliness and due diligence of what has happened since. And so we're just going to go into a little bit more detail about the whole process of vacatur. We can go to the next slide. And we can go to the next slide. So this is just breaking down the legal systems. And so we didn't take a survey in the beginning. I'm not sure how many folks are actually practicing attorneys on the participant list. I see a few names who I know are not attorneys. So this might be very basic for some folks, but I just wanted to make sure everybody had a foundation about the different roles that what you'll see in the legal system. So there's the prosecutor, which we'd fall under District Attorney Nancy O'Malley's office and Sharmin Bock and the work that they're doing where they're going after the accused. There's a victim rights attorney, which is the work that we do at Justice at Last, where we're representing crime victims. And it could be all different types of representation, but in particular here, we're talking about records clearance. And then there's the public defender. Their role is to protect the innocence of the accused. So we can go on to the next slide. And so now we're going to look at, like, within that criminal system, when individuals are charged, what does that look like for forms of relief? And so if we're looking at vacatur, if there's an individual that you're representing who has outstanding bench warrants, they can't get vacatur at this point. There's going to have to be a process. So when we work with pro bono counsel, we've already done those initial steps. We've already determined, does an individual have outstanding bench warrants? We need to get those recalled first and foremost before we can move forward and do the vacatur. And in some jurisdictions, if there's an outstanding bench warrant and there's no other convictions, then we can do the vacatur all at once. But so there's, if there's been an arrest or a conviction, these are the different options. So for arrest, we're looking at vacatur, there's sealing based on factual innocence, bench warrants to recall. And then for convictions, it's vacatur, it's expungement if it doesn't rise to the level, if it doesn't meet one of the crimes that depending on what happened. And then there's potentially a pardon, but that's very rare. And we've never come and really encountered that. And then for juvenile adjudications, you can primarily, first and foremost, is what you want to do is vacate, because again, it's clearing off that record so that it doesn't appear whatsoever. And then record sealing is also an option. So we can go to the next slide. So this is just talking about bench warrants when you're working with a survivor and they do have these open bench warrants. Again, those are going to have to be addressed first. We work closely with the prosecutor. We work closely with the defender if they're already working with the defender when there's open bench warrants. So we can move on to the next slide. So these are just some considerations about what it's going to need to do. Again, it goes back to working with. And so what does that mean? If you're working with a client who identifies as being a victim of human trafficking and they have an outstanding bench warrant, what we'd want to do is reach out to our partners, reach out to the public defender, reach out to the prosecution, let them know what's going on. There potentially might be a case there worth following up on for the trafficker, depending on if the individual survivor wants to make statements specifically, if it's a recent trafficking situation. And so a lot of the work that we do in the vacatur realm is built on partnerships and relationships. We can go to the next slide. So then let's switch over to when we're talking about the case is actually closed and we're formally going to be seeking vacatur. So we'll be doing that with convictions and arrests. Quite often individuals think, well, my arrest was dismissed, so I don't have a record. That still remains on the record unless it's vacated or sealed. And likewise with the juvenile records. I know that California has a sealing law for minors. However, what we found in different jurisdictions that their records aren't necessarily sealed. And so then they don't realize that until they apply for a job. They try to attempt to join the military, whatever it might be, where the records are divulged at that point. So we can move on to the next slide. So this just is a little bit about the differences between expungement and vacatur. So vacatur didn't come into law until 2017. So prior to that, individuals had no choice but to get expungement if they were going to do anything. And one point prior to 2017, I think in 2015, California had a law specifically for survivors of human trafficking for expungement. However, it really failed because it didn't remove the conviction on their record, number one, but number two, they also were still responsible and liable for any fees that had transpired over the course of that conviction. And they also had to disclose that not only had they been trafficked, but then that they've been rehabilitated. And so that's going back to language, which Sharmin talked about, is we want to be really mindful of rehabilitation, especially when we're talking about someone who was forced to commit a crime. So I think the next one or two slides also talks about the differences of expungement and vacatur. So we can move on to those. And I think the main thing to take away is that expungement's not the answer. If you're working with an individual who identifies as being trafficked, because they have greater relief by going and getting that vacatur. So it's just something to be mindful of. We've definitely worked with survivors where they say, well, my record's already been expunged, so I don't have a record. again, not fully understanding that it's still on their record. And so what we'll often do is get a live scan, sometimes referred to as a rap sheet. We'll get that pulled where they can actually see it's still on there, even though it was quote unquote expunged. In fact, we worked with a client a few years ago where her grandmother hired a private defender to get her records addressed. Like, she had outstanding bench warrants. She was sex trafficked across the United States from here in the Bay Area. She was groomed from 17, and as soon as she turned 18, that's when the trafficking occurred. Anyway, after she got out of that situation, her grandmother hired a private attorney, and she thought cleared up all her records. But unfortunately, what the private attorney was doing was making plea bargains for the most part. And so when she attempted to apply for a job working with survivors, and they did a background check, she was denied the position because she had a record. So again, just understanding if it's a survivor of trafficking, we always want to talk about vacatur with them. We can go to the next slide. And we can go on to the next slide as well. You can review that at your leisure. I just want to be mindful of the time that we have, because I also went, Sharmin and I are also going to talk about the process itself when it's time to move forward with a petition for vacatur. So what is the legislative intent? It's kind of like what we've already talked about. Lawmakers actually recognize that expungement laws were not doing what they needed to do to help uplift and empower survivors and get them to that point where they could be independent, where they could seek, move forward with whatever it is that they wanted to do in their life. The practice of arresting victims of trafficking actually created a broken system. And again, going back to, the individual not wanting to even participate in the legal system because they themselves have been deemed a criminal when they know, in fact, that they were forced to commit those crimes. So the intent was to create a complete reprieve for survivors to ensure that there's no adverse consequences. And so we can move forward to the next slide. So we'll go back to these elements because it's really important to understand them and know them and be very clear when you're articulating in the petition for an individual to get vacatur relief. So again, they have to identify that they were a survivor. So another reason why so many of our clients that are seeking vacatur relief, it's been a period of time since they've been out of that lifestyle, because while they're in it, there's so many things going on, they're not probably identifying as a victim. And it's not until they have the opportunity to be stable and to get support and have that opportunity to heal where they identify and say, you know what, I was forced to do that. Yes, I am a victim. Because that's critical. If you're not, you won't have success with vacatur relief if the individual doesn't identify as being a victim of trafficking. So we already talked about the eligible offense, and juvenile adjudications qualify. And then there's that critical nexus to the arrest and conviction to the trafficking, and then the timeliness. So we're going to break those down right now into the next few slides. So what does a victim of human trafficking mean? Sharmin shared that. She read out the different subdivisions of survivors of human trafficking. I think the main thing to take away is definitely look it up. It's referenced, the code itself is one of the handouts. So primarily, like if you had to summarize it, it's going to be adults that are labor trafficked and or sex trafficked for adults, and or children that are labor trafficked will fall under one realm where there needs to be that force or fraud or coercion to have occurred. And then for minors that are sex trafficked, again, as Sharmin already explained, the prosecutor is not going to have to show that there was that force or fraud or coercion. It's just that the act occurred or there was the intent of that act to occur. So you need to make sure that you understand that and that it's clear in the petition. And we can move to the next one. We're looking at the offense. So I think you just need to hit, yeah. So it's a non-violent offense. as of the end of this year. It will slightly change in 2022. And we can just move on. And then the nexus. So the offense committed while he or she was a victim of human trafficking. And so to get that, you have to have clear and convincing evidence that the arrest, that the conviction was actually a direct result of that victimhood. So in the instance, the story that Nancy shared with us in the very beginning, they did have that. They had witnesses who, obviously saw the woman hop into the truck and drive it off. It wasn't until after, I think probably over a period of time where she was able to share what transpired and that she was trying to flee the trafficker. So there would be, you've got witnesses there, but there's also other clear and convincing evidence that we're going to look at that we'll talk about in the next slides. And then the other element is that the victim engaged in good faith to actually distance themselves from the trafficking scheme after it's occurred. Again, there will be challenges if the individual was trafficked for a period of time, is no longer being trafficked, and they identify as a survivor. They want to move forward with their vacatur, but something happens in their life. They become vulnerable over that process and they end up going back to whether it was sexual exploitation or labor trafficking. If they're back in that scheme, it's going to be difficult to show that there's been distance and that vulnerability doesn't exist anymore. So that's one thing that also explains why many of the survivors we're working with, it's been a period of time since they've been out of that lifestyle before they're ready to move forward and seek vacatur. And then it has to be in the best interest of the petitioner and in the interest of justice. So, which it is, just based on explaining what had happened in the past, so we can move forward. So again, working closely with our partnerships, regardless of where the crime is, one of my roles as an attorney is the first thing is I'm going to have a conversation with the prosecutor. I'm going to reach out to Sharmin or whatever the community is, the jurisdiction, and give them a heads up about we working with this client, and she was sex trafficked as a minor from 12 to 17, and then she was out of the life at 18, but then she was trafficked again from 19 to 23. And this is what happened over the course of her exploitation. And what do you think about it? And just have a conversation to give the prosecution an understanding of what it is, who we're working with, and what our intentions are. And that always seems to help. And so the prosecutor, and again, Sharmin chime in, might say, well, you know what? I think what you're telling me right now is a little weak. I'm not so sure that I am convinced that this person was being trafficked at the time of the crime. So we start this conversation. I get a better sense and understanding of what they're looking for, what the prosecutor's looking for to move it forward. But once we file the petition and the prosecution, then at that point has 45 days to respond. If there's no opposition, court could actually deem the petition to be unopposed and grant it without any formal hearing where the survivor has to come to court and explain what's happened to them. And again, based on those building of relationships beforehand, we've had great success with not having to have a formal hearing where the survivor in particular has to come and explain what's going on. So we can go on to the next slide.
Let me just jump in for a
Yes,
sec
please.
before you go to if the prosecutor opposes. I'm the prosecutor in this office that handles these petitions, and let me just say what I look at. What I look at is sort of I look at two things really right off the bat. One is I look at the causation element, right? And when I did my presentation for you backwards. Like I don't usually do the victimology piece first when I do presentations, sort of the CSEC 101 presentation to give everyone sort of the intro to child sex trafficking. I usually do the law first, and then I talk about the victimology later, right? But the reason why I wanted to do the victimology first is because the law you can get by opening up the penal code. But the victimology is probably one of the most important components of your work in vacatures, because you're dealing with somebody who at the time probably didn't recognize that they were even a victim, right? So it's, they didn't get that they were even, they wouldn't be able to articulate, right? Which is why I was so big on Prop 35 and writing the law as we did. They didn't get that they were under the coercive effect of their trafficker, right? Like think Jonestown, think Kool-Aid beverage, right? They had that Kool-Aid drink and they didn't know it. And so it's really important to show the impact that that trafficker had on them. That's the first piece. And how do you show that, right? Well, if in the paperwork, so I had this one vacatur petition that came to me, and it was literally like, can you see my hands? It was like this thick. It looked like an unprovoked assault on our nation's forests. It was like so many pieces of paper, and there was nothing in there that said anything about the trafficker. Like she wasn't saying who he was, nothing. It was just like not spilling the beans. And so that's like that kind of like ding, 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 ding. It's like you're not spilling the beans on the trafficker or what happened. And I kind of need to know that story because it seems like when they're not telling that story, they're somehow still under the coercive effect of the trafficker in some regard, or it just doesn't seem credible, right? It seems like, oh yeah, I'm just going to use this vacatur thing to get my record cleaned. So we really do need, remember I talked about corroboration, and I told you that when we go to prove our trafficking cases, we have to corroborate our cases. And so, and I listed everything from like text messages to cell phones to, receipts to whatever you can find to prove that she was actually trafficked. So something to back up her statement that she was trafficked. So it's not just, yeah, I was trafficked. I had this life and then, yeah, I happened to be trafficked. So, in the Nancy story, we had witnesses. So there needs to be something that has the ring of truth to it. It doesn't have to be trafficking about trafficking. It could be something unrelated to trafficking that just ties in and shows me that she's telling the truth, right? And so that corroboration piece is very important. The other piece is that it is causally connected, so that that the trafficking happened and the crime that he or she committed happened as a result, as a direct result. And we actually wrote that language in, the direct result language, so that there is a tie to it, so that you're not committing these crimes and then having this trafficking at this other point in time, that they're linked to one another. And when you have great lawyers like Rose, I mean, she just goes right to it. I mean, sometimes we don't even need to get into all these petitions. She can just tell me and I'm like, okay, got it. And so it's really important too, that when you do these cases, that there's nothing more important than your word. And so don't overstate it and don't understate it, just state it. Because like Rose can tell me the sky is green and I'll be like, great. Okay, it's green, because we have had this working relationship with one another for many years now. We've taught everywhere from here to Stanford to you name it, nationally and locally. And I just trust what she tells me. And that goes a very, very long way. So remember that when you're doing your vacatures, that your word is your bond, and that you got to dig deep, and that you need to remember the psychology and the victimology of who you're talking to. Because maybe they haven't come to terms yet with what they've experienced, and that you're dealing with them in various stages of their healing journey, and it's a process. So that's a big part of it for them.
Awesome. Thank you, Sharmin. Yeah. And we can, I think all of that is true. And, what you see here on here, if the prosecutor opposes, if it goes to full court, it's still the judge is going to make the decision. And it's based on exactly what Sharmin just stressed, right? Like the court is going to have to find that it's tied to the trafficking. It's a direct result. And then what the survivor's done since. And I think going forward, I think even the next one or two slides deal specifically with when you're working with a survivor, like how critical it is to be trauma informed. I know the training tomorrow that Missy's going to be focusing on, we'll talk about being trauma informed and best practices when working with survivors. We can move forward to the next slide. This is, again, if there's going to be a hearing for the survivor to make an appearance, they can appear telephonically. Well, we're in COVID world right now, so there's a lot of that going on, but the law allowed for that prior to COVID. So that's nice, because if we're talking about an individual who's got numerous convictions in different, up and down the state of California, to be able to make an appearance telephonically. And then also the consolidation, which was really amazing that this law did this. And so you have to work with the prosecutors to get their consent. But if we're dealing with, there's an LA conviction, there's a Sacramento conviction, and there's an Alameda County and a Santa Clara conviction, where rather than have the survivor file 4 separate petitions, if we can get the prosecutors to agree that we could have it in one court, and then that we have to figure out which court would be the most appropriate. So great, this law is phenomenal. Go ahead, Sharmin.
And here's a heads up. Know that when that happens, know that the prosecutors talk to one another.
Yeah.
So we have cases where, I had a case where this woman had like 10 DUIs over a certain period of time. And I have to tell you that of all the cases that I've done, that was one of my hardest, were the DUIs. And remember how Rose was saying it's sort of like a 2-part thing, or I was saying too, that you look at sort of for me, I look at the causation piece, and you also look at where are they now? Is this a scam, or are they really in good faith moved on? Are they, no longer using this as an excuse? And in that particular case, that woman had been sober for 10 years.
Sure.
And I got to tell you that did it for me. Actually, she was sober for 11, and she was getting a college degree. And because, you could say, how is drinking a direct result of being trafficked? You could say, well, the pain of being trafficked is so severe that it causes me to drink. Does it cause you to drink and then to get into a car and drive all these different times?
Mm-hmm.
So it was really, that was a tricky one for me. It was really, I struggled with it. And, I talked to some other people who didn't have a hard time with it. I came around and I ultimately did not have it. I ultimately conceded. But what really did it for me was not the cause, at first I struggled with causation, because I'm like, come on, what do you say? I was the drink, it was the bong hit, it was the, where do you draw the line? And then, but what did it for me was the after story. So don't lose sight of the importance of the after story. So not just what happened then, but where are they today?
Yes.
That's very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We can go to the next slide. Works not, how can somebody tell me the slide number? I know we've got 12 minutes left, so I want to be mindful. We might skip over a few of the slides. You have the PowerPoint. This just talks about the process.
We are on, can you hear me, Rose?
Yeah,
We're on slide 32 at the moment.
All right, so let's move forward about the process, because that's something that you can review, and it's pretty straightforward. You've got to get a rap sheet, right? You have to get a live scan. And then this just talks about the petition that you'll need. We can move forward there. I would like to get into the being trauma informed, and then we can open it up for questions. This is what's going to be required in the motion. We kind of already talked about this, about what is going to be expected in the petition itself. We can move forward. So another good thing about this particular vacatur law is that it has to be filed under seal. And so the individual survivor's name is not public when they file this. And that helps our clients out tremendously, because what they are really fearful of is that the trafficker might, even though maybe it's 10 years after they've been trafficked, the trafficker might find out about what they're sharing, what they're filing, and that they're trying to clear their record. And that's actually, for a lot of folks, that's part of the reason why they're hesitant to move forward, is the worry because of the constant, when they were trafficked, the continuous threats day in and day out. If they were to tell anybody, if they tell law enforcement, if they, whoever it is they share it with, the trafficker will hunt them down and come after them. And so that's a huge concern. So again, this law, the caveat with having there be the confidentiality, it helps tremendously. And we can move forward. So what's the types of cooperation? Sharmin already kind of talked about that. So we can move on there in terms of documents, official documentation. Means any documents issued by. So if there's an individual you're working with who's a foreign national and maybe they've already received their T visa, that's pretty good official documentation to submit as part of the vacatur petition, because at the federal level, they've already been deemed to be a survivor of human trafficking. We can move forward. And then this is a case out in New York where there wasn't any actual formal documentation. And based on the sworn statement by the survivor, they were able to move forward on that alone. So relying on case law in California for New York might be challenging, but this was an old law, or an old case. There might be newer cases with different states, especially as more states have vacatur laws moving forward. We can go on to the next one. So let's just talk a little bit about trauma, and I'll summarize this in a couple minutes, and then we can open it up for questions. It's really important, like we've all shared, about how critical it is to work with survivors and be trauma informed and not be judging them about, did that really happen to you? I can't believe that. And you'd be shocked about the different responses I've heard from pro bono attorneys when they meeting for the first time the client they're going to represent, and the questions that they're asking. So it's just to be mindful, and I'm grateful for the folks that are going to come back tomorrow and hear the training that Missy has about how do you be trauma informed. If we go to the next slide, it's just a kind of a little bit of a summary. I think the next two slides actually touch on it. Just keep in mind that when you're working with a survivor, to file that petition, to get those detailed information that Sharmin explained that she needs as a prosecutor, and the judge will require as well, that the survivor's memory might not be that coherent. And so sometimes pro bono attorneys will think, well, they're lying to me, they're not telling me the truth. When the reality is the impact of trauma and on memory. And so it might take numerous conversations. It might take a while even to build rapport so that the client trusts you to share those details that happened to them. It's just something to be keeping in mind, and not to just be quick to turn around and say, this person is just not cooperating, because that they might very well be trying their hardest to come forward with what happened to them. They just can't remember. We can go to the next slide. And there's different ways to work around that. And we provide TA on that as well. So trauma impacts memory. The best practices, don't misinterpret that as evasiveness or lying. And just be honest with the client about, oh, I understand this is all you remember. However, we've got a significant gap here. So we are concerned. We've got to figure out how we can bridge that. How are we going to be able to get information to fill that gap?
You know, Rose, we get that too. And that's why having vacatures be housed in the heat unit it's a cozy home for vacatures, because this is exactly what we deal with in trying to prove our human trafficking cases. So we completely appreciate the impact of trauma on the brain and on how stories are told. And you know, what may seem like lying really isn't. It's just disordered thought processes because of the impact of trauma.
Yeah, nope, absolutely. Yeah. We can go on to the next one. So this you'll just have to hit each time. So just to make sure, recognizing the symptoms of trauma, and don't judge, don't react in disgust or shock. You know, we've even had feedback from a survivor where they shared their story and the social worker proceeded to cry, like uncontrollably cry. And that just discouraged the survivor from sharing anything else at that point, because they were seeking professional help and the professional broke down. And so we are all human. We're all going to be impacted when we hear these stories, but just try to do your best to not react at that moment. And that's hard, right? Because we are all human and we're all touched by this and we're wanting to get involved because we care, but just be mindful of that impact of your response on the survivor. So, and I think that for the trauma-informed advocacy, I think is it. We can talk about motivational hearing at another training. The next slide just has some resources, and the Freedom Network USA actually right now is supporting the American Bar Association Survivor Reentry Program. They're the ones that created it, but the American Bar no longer manages it. So now it's managed by the Freedom Network USA. And the good thing about them is they've got these phenomenal resources that are nationwide. And then also that it's a clearinghouse for survivors. So if survivor themselves doesn't know who to contact if they want to seek relief for their records, they can reach out to the Freedom Network under the Survivor Reentry Project, and they'll get a referral to Justice at Last if they're in the Bay Area in California. Or they'll get a referral to Lotus Clinic in Wisconsin, or whoever's working on it, wherever the survivor's located or their crimes are. Because again, remember, trafficking happens all over, right? One individual isn't going to just be trafficked here in the Bay. It might happen. Often they're trafficked in several locations. And I think that's it. Thank you. You can stop sharing that.
Thanks so much. We do have a question from Ellen Levinson. She would like to know, if you're filing a petition on behalf of a minor, do you need parental consent?
It depends on the age of the minor, and I would be interested to know where that's taking place. If there's what state is charging the minor. Here in the Bay Area, as in particular Alameda County, we found that the prosecution is not charging minors. So it wouldn't be an issue where you'd have to actually file a petition for vacatur for a minor. That's to not say that you might be working with a 25-year-old who at the time was trafficked and got a criminal record when they were a minor. But I think for that question, Ellen, it would depend also on their age. If, I think if they're under 13, you probably would also want to look at who the trafficker was. It very well might actually be the parents themselves. But we do represent minors, and usually the family is not involved. And if they are, we're working directly with the minor themselves. So I don't know if that doesn't answer your question. Sharmin?
I don't see how you would need the parents' consent.
Right.
Because it's the rights are the victim's rights, right? So I think that if the victim wanted to set aside to vacate her or his conviction, that would be their right. I think a problem you have when the minor has committed an offense that is a direct result of trafficking and is seeking to vacate that, I think you're going to run into that second prong to prove that there's a good faith basis to show that they're no longer under the influence of the trafficker. Because, if they're 13 or 14 or 15, chances are the trafficker's still hovering nearby, because at that age, there's still a human ATM machine for that trafficker. So, that's a challenging one from a variety of perspectives, Ellen.
Thank you both. I just have one quick question before we wrap this up. How often are hearings actually held if the DA is not opposing the petition?
Never.
So
there's no.
So basically, Sharmin, if it's in an Alameda County case, if your office doesn't oppose the petition, then it's granted.
Right. So I get all the motions, I review them, I call the lawyers up, and we've been, Nancy O'Malley has been a leader in this field, right? So our predisposition is to create open roads for survivors to spread their wings. Let me just say that, right? So every benefit of every doubt is given to the victims, right? So when I'm calling back these defense attorneys to say, could you please prove that this girl was trafficked? I'm not asking for the moon. I'm just like, you took down all these trees and there's no proof of trafficking in here. Come on, do it. And so, you know, we really, I'd rather concede than fight, you know, because these youth have already experienced such challenges even before they got trafficked. I mean, you saw the data, right? I mean, before they got, what got them to be trafficked up until that point was horrific, right? I mean, and we're seeing they come from marginalized communities, often children of color, racial inequalities, discrimination. I mean, it's just across the board, social inequities. I mean, that's just before they got trafficked. Then they get taken by some guy who's trying to make money on them, and they think it's love, or they've been, you know, I had a case where the girl was chained to a kitchen table for God knows how long. I mean, so really, like, we are hoping to clear their record, but there's some basic elements that need to be shown, and it's just very methodical. Just show us that it was, the causation piece exists and they're past it and doing something with their lives. It kind of boils down to that. And then we don't need to even get in front of a judge.
Thank you for answering those questions. Thank you both so much. I know we're coming up to the end of our time, and I know Rose has a hard stop, so I want to thank you, Rose, so much for today, and we will see you back tomorrow, Rose, where Rose will be presenting in the second hour tomorrow on crime victims' rights, and we are looking forward to hearing that. And Sharmin, thank you so much. We really appreciate what both of you do in your everyday work, as well as what you've done by helping us present this webinar today. Also, for all the attendees, if you please use the same link to come back tomorrow at noon. Hopefully we'll have fewer tech issues tomorrow, and we'll be able to start soon after noon tomorrow. And if you're seeking MCLE credit, again, you just need to respond to the SurveyMonkey feedback. And we ask that everybody go ahead and fill out that feedback form as well, even if you're not seeking MCLE credit, because we like to have the feedback. So, and we'll also be welcoming tomorrow Andrea Diaz with Missy, motivating, inspiring. I have to read this because I always forget. Motivating, inspiring, supporting, and serving sexually exploited youth, and she'll be providing a presentation about trauma-informed representation, which is really key. So thanks, everybody. We really appreciate it. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us, and thank you for the partnerships, really. And we have callers, participants joining this training that are also partners, and it really speaks volumes about the work we're able to do only because we're doing it together. So that makes the difference. Thank you.
Absolutely. And also, speaking of partners, not on the grant, but in this webinar, I wanted to give a shout out to Queens Bench Bar Association. Queens Bench is providing the MCLE credit for this webinar.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Bye. Good luck with your Vacatur.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you.